Göbekli Tepe is the most bewildering and astonishing sight.
Like so many places, you can see photographs of things, and nothing prepares you for actually being there in the flesh.
Göbekli Tepe is a challenge on so many levels, because it confounds your normal expectations, and it confounds your normal abilities perhaps to be able to work things out from what's in front of your face. It's quite an overwhelming sight from that point of view.
We arrived on that walkway and you walk around and look down into this, building D particularly. That's a vast underground building. It's immense. I don't care how skilled those craftsmen were in cutting away all that bedrock. That's still a phenomenal amount of work. And that just hits you like a hammer.
I do need a minute.
The impression you get when you're there is people. It's overwhelming.
It is quite emotional, really.
Not only do you have all these statues and all the imagery and everything that gives you an idea of what was important to these people, but everywhere you look, whether it's the broken grinding stones or broken vessels that are incorporated into the walls, it's just this overwhelming thing of people just being there. You don't get details from photographs.
Could be a hunting scene.
For example, these little drill holes. Don't know what tools they used to do that, but these holes drilled through the corners of pillars so that they could tie, whether it was textiles or fabrics or furs, that you can see from these holes that are drilled, they're all over the place, that you can tell the whole place was really decorated and adorned in all sorts of stuff. And you don't get that impression from the photographs. It's only when you see those kinds of details that you realise quite how rich, visually rich, their world must have been. So we were taken into the areas that are, they're not open to the public. The fascinating thing about going into the only partially excavated areas is that you see the tops of T-pillars on the ground. So you're looking down, at your foot, there is the top of a T-pillar, and it's just as big as the T-pillars that you've seen inside the main buildings. So you know that 5-6 meters under your feet, there's yet more stuff, and it's staggering to think how much is there, and for such a huge amount of time. I mean, you think of anything that we know today of settlements where we live, particularly if we're in Britain, say, where we have deep history, or Northern Europe, where we have deep history in the cities that still exist. And you think, we go back hundreds of years, but the notion of being somewhere where you can pinpoint 1,000 years in time, that's like us going back to the Norman Conquest. It's huge, and we see it just in this small, it's a big settlement, but nevertheless, by today's standards, it's a small place, and you just have this overwhelming feeling of the expanse of time.
It requires careful thought to be honest with it, to be intellectually honest with it, with Göbekli Tepe. It presents so many enigmas that it's so easy to go off down rabbit holes.
You can't blame the public for this. You have to blame the media for this, and the fact that archaeologists are very bad at PR. But the thing is that there is so much exciting stuff in deep prehistory. So going back, 10,000 years before Göbekli Tepe, so many really exciting, established settlements where circular buildings, semi-subterranean buildings,
special buildings, stone-built buildings, mud brick-built buildings.
People were very established in the way they were living for a long period of time. But none of this in-your-face flamboyant art.
Timber posts in exactly the same positions that we see at Göbekli Tepe, set into the surrounding walls of albeit smaller, but nevertheless quite substantial circular buildings.
Anybody could just do a Google search on prehistoric sites. Look up the Natufians. Natufian sites that are 15,000 years old. And, okay, they're not in-your-face arty, but they're nicely floored, well-established houses. They had comfortable lifestyles. So many people have never even heard of them.
Tempting to wonder, if some of the art forms that see at Göbekli Tepe may have pre-represented in wood in previous times. Unfortunately, wood tends to disappear, so there's no evidence. But if I was to conjecture a little bit, I suppose, yes, why not? It's much easier to carve something out of wood. And if they were capable of chipping stuff out of stone, and they were, not way before we get to Göbekli Tepe, Benin, and various other sites, there's iconography beginning to appear, sometimes cruder, sometimes recognizable, the kind of things that get represented at Göbekli Tepe, birds' heads, occasional human figure.
The emphasis, what was important to people was changing through this period.
There is a development through time.
1,000 years down the line, you look at places like Çatalhöyük, where none of that artistry in that way is taking place. You get paintings on the walls, and the paintings are about animals that they're catching and what have you, but none of that massive in-your-face carving is going on anymore. One of the biggest problems in the public perception of any major piece of archaeology is that most people get their information from the media. So they get this, an exciting headline that comes out about Göbekli Tepe being found, and it was a temple. It was the first temple, and people didn't live there. They just came from outside to this place.
Well, I mean, up until a few years ago, I would have been with everybody else and said, well, this is weird, because it's out there in the middle of nowhere, a temple with no evidence of people living there, or whatever, a special building, put it that way, or special buildings in the middle of nowhere with no explanation about why people would choose that spot to go to. Apparently it's pretty dry, or supposed to be dry. How would they feed themselves? How would they subsist there? And that creates an air of mystery straight off, if that's your only information about Göbekli Tepe.
And the years go on, and excavations go on, and the new headlines aren't exciting, or potential headlines aren't exciting. So the media doesn't write about it, so the public doesn't hear about it. So you have perceptions now about it being a temple that was deliberately buried, and all these things that the archaeology has shown those to be completely wrong, but the public never get to hear about these things. Göbekli Tepe is a huge settlement. Everybody talks about at Göbekli Tepe that there are the special buildings, maybe they were temples, but these special buildings, and people still believe that there were no residential places here, but actually there's so much residential stuff here, building upon building upon building, and that's what you're looking at now.
Yeah, and if you needed any proof that these were domesticated areas, look at this beautiful limestone basin. Goodness knows how long it took to make that basin, let alone, anything
But
else.
whether it's a storage vessel of some sort, what have you, don't know. But there is, I mean, if in the back of this house, so there's another bench at the back, that it's just places for people to be comfortable.
Yeah. Always got to imagine it with a roof as well. And that
Yeah,
pillar
the T-pillar there at the back, what's remained of it, that would have been supporting the roof. And why they look so alien to us because they don't have doors is because, like most of the other structures in this part of the world, access was through the roof, with ladders going down into the inside. But these are all houses, little houses. Bench at the back of that one.
Yeah.
And it's staggering when, I mean, from here, you can look over to the opposite hill.
Yeah.
I say the opposite hill, just the other side of the main site. And that's all more residential houses over the other side. There are so many of them. There were a lot of people living here.
Yeah.
So all the old information about this only being a ritual site is just not true at all.
And the area that we've traversed, we just walked past now, is but a fraction of this domesticated or residential area. Interestingly, just here, we've got a corner of a skylight. That stone there would have been supported in the roof.
And that's how people would have got down into the building potentially, or it might just have been to let light in. So much of it.
And all leading down to the site that so many people are familiar with. And it's a wonderful thing to stand here with people milling about, because at least that gives a sense of busyness.
That's
with
true.
that many people living in this place. It would have been noisy, would have been smelly.
It would have been noisy and
thronged.
smelly for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I hope that makes the point. There's a lot more to Göbekli Tepe than a temple site. I think it bears repeating over and over again that this notion that they were hunter-gatherers at Göbekli Tepe, and there's some kind of mismatch between this building on the hill, up the hill there, and that simple, primitive hunter-gatherers couldn't possibly have built this site. It just needs reiterating that they weren't simple hunter-gatherers. There's a alternative term coined by Trevor Watkins, and he prefers the term hunter-harvesters.
Which is much more appropriate, but still doesn't hit the spot for me. It's the thing is that hunter-gathering, all that hunter-gathering means is not farming. It doesn't say anything about whether people are primitive in any way. It is just that's how they got their food.
What used to be the received wisdom was that one moment people are wandering about the landscape following the herds, and the next moment they've settled down because they've discovered farming. But that's not the case. There's a middle stage which lasts over the 10,000 years before you get to Göbekli Tepe, where people had changed that life way. They had begun to settle down.
And the crazy thing about that is that there are sites in the Middle East that have been known about for decades.
I'll just put a list up the side here that can scroll up and down, just so you get a flavour, of the amount of archaeology that's been going on. The epitome of what I'm talking about is, 21,000 years BC, 1989, discovered on the banks of the Sea of Galilee is a site known as Ahalo 2, which its discovery is a miracle in itself because the people that left it there burnt it down so that the carbon was absorbed into the muddy banks of the Galilee, and B, at the time of the discovery of it, the waters had receded. So we've got this little oasis of archaeological gem that tells us so much and pushes back the date to which we know people were settled down, that they were grinding wild grasses and wheat.
Ahalo 2, so 23,000 years ago, you had a settlement. People were settled there. They were hunter-gatherers, they weren't farmers, but they were settled.
Their diet had broadened out in what is called the broad spectrum diet.
No fancy special buildings, but the point is it was an established settlement for a long period of time.
They'd stopped hunting the big game so much, and whichever way around it was, chicken and egg situation, but whichever way around it was, something enabled them to start hunting smaller game, or they were forced to start hunting smaller game. Not only that, but they were also managing the wild cereals and utilizing the wild cereals around them.
These people were so settled in their environment that they were exploiting in the environment. They were harvesting or exploiting, if you like, over 120 species of plant.
Huge varieties of grasses and wild barley, wild wheat and so on and so forth.
You really do need to know your environment to be making that a thing. And that's not including the animals that they were eating. That's just how well they were making a living from the land, if you like.
And it's this notion that people who became sedentary, their relationship with their landscape and with the food that they were gathering completely changed. So they were hunting far smaller mammals, not only mammals, amphibians, frogs, birds, all those kinds of things. And this is emphasized by the fact that their tools, their hunting tools, became smaller. Arrowheads, lightweight, tiny arrowheads for small game and stuff like that. So these are people that had their landscape handled. They knew where to settle down, where they could have everything, basically, without having to follow the herd.
There are so many sites. There's another site, El Wad, which is, I can't remember the date, 19,000 years old, something like that. And the thing about that is that it started off as a cave dwelling, but as the settlement grew, as the numbers of people grew, they actually started terracing the land around the cave and building their houses outside. So the heart of the settlement was the cave, but over time it just expanded outwards. They were settled that long ago.
They had their environment handled. Actually, we had a discussion with Dr. Lee Clare on the hill just north of the main buildings and domestic buildings at Göbekli Tepe, in which we discussed that very thing, the kinds of lifeways that they were enjoying at that time. And I hope it helps make the distinction and shows you that these people would have been perfectly capable, especially as they were enabled to settle down in this place, perfectly capable of building Göbekli Tepe.
Well, here we are on the western end of the tell, Göbekli Tepe behind us, and we're just looking out across this landscape. And so, Lee, I mean, This barren landscape. Now, I mean, you say barren, but I mean, okay, there's olive groves and what have you. But it looks harsh. But 10,000 years ago, this was lush, and people living here, just going out onto the landscape and being able to gather enough grain or Lord knows what to keep themselves going. What's the thinking on how people were actually living with the landscape back then?
Okay, I mean, the best indications we have for how the landscape was are, of course, on the one hand, archaeobotanical remains, and on the other, the animal remains of the hunted quarry and what they were using. So, we know for a fact that they were hunting a lot of gazelle, so we'd have a gazelle moving around the landscape. They were hunting aurochs, they were hunting wild boar, the three most important animals perhaps. And of course those animals require certain landscapes to live in. So especially with the wild boar and the aurochs, I mean obviously it was a lot wetter and moister than it was today. And thinking, today what we're seeing here is a cultural landscape, obviously, over 10,000 plus years. We've got grazing going on here, we've got a lot of farming going on here. I mean, just out of shot here, we've got it is a lot greener, but that's because of the water coming in from the dams and from the lakes that have been made. By us, by humans, as it were. And so they're farming a lot of the time in the year. But so it's a cultural landscape. But at the time, we also know that they were using certain woods. We've got charcoal remains, for example. We've got other botanical remains. So they were collecting wild cereals. We talk there of pre-domestication cultivation, all the grinding stones. And we've got the animal remains, as I say. So it would have been like an open woodland. It would have been scattered with oaks and wild almond, that sort of thing, and with watery or moister areas where these animals that I just mentioned were gathering, where they could be hunted. So a very, like I said, a lush landscape compared to what we have today, to this cultural landscape.
Because so many people are confused by the thing that they've heard that this is a hunter-gatherer site, and they can't associate this site with people who are being nomadic, which is what has got fixed in people's minds. So I suppose it's putting Göbekli Tepe in the whole chronology of the development of farming from the broad spectrum that we know about from 10,000 years before Göbekli Tepe itself came into existence.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about a long duration, the longue durée of this transition from mobile hunter-gathering to sort of sedentary farming. It took many thousands of years, and we're actually in the middle of that, you could say, here at Göbekli Tepe, although I have to stress we don't have any domesticated animals or plant species so far in the archaeological record. So what we're dealing with here, and we know that people were living here, we've got the domestic buildings to prove that. We have the grinding stones, for example, which can't be moved around very easily, obviously because they're so heavy. So we are expecting that the people here were sedentary hunter-gatherers, or hunter-foragers. They were using Göbekli Tepe as a base. They were still very mobile. I mean, in the early years of the site, we think that the site was first occupied in the second half of the 10th millennium BC. So with the Holocene climate amelioration coming in, after the Younger Dryas, things were, looking a bit better climate-wise. And they were still mobile, as I say. They were going out hunting, they were going out gathering and foraging, but they had this as their base, as it were. And in the early years, in the PPNA, we're looking around 9,500 BC to about 8,700 BC. We've got evidence of domestic buildings from that period. But of course, we don't know, they're only in small areas of the excavation, so we don't know how big that settlement was. But at least, and we don't know how often, or perhaps they were visiting frequently, and at the beginning not actually sort of being sedentary here, and then that increased in the course of time. And by the PPNB, later on by the mid-9th millennium BC, we've got a flourishing settlement. So I think that in the course of the duration of the site, we're having an increasing sort of level of people staying put and the settlement developing. Yeah.
So I'll tell you what, I suggest that we actually get up and walk around a bit.
An interesting aspect, though, is when we know that people could harvest such large quantities of wild grains, and that they needed to settle down, well, they had to settle down because they couldn't carry that around with them. If you've collected enough grain for months and months, potentially even for a year, you can't carry that. So you've got to settle down. And do we have sites like this developing over time because people needed to settle down in the first place?
So you're talking about storage now. I mean, whether we have evidence for storage of sort of wild grain or what have you during the Neolithic. I mean, we don't have the stores, we don't have the grain, heaps of grain that we have excavated. Other sites do have that, but we don't have that here. I mean, what we do have, of course, are smaller rooms. Even in the PPNA sort of domestic area that we excavated a few years back, we did have smaller sort of conglomerative sort of building structures which could have been used for storage, although there wasn't any finds of like stored cereals in that or wild cereals in those buildings. But later on in the course of time, of course, we do find these great big sort of limestone vessels that do appear and which, in my opinion, were used for storage, perhaps for storage of certain groups or families living in a certain area of the site. Yeah. So, these are very big sort of limestone vessels. And I think that's one piece of evidence that we can't sort of, pass by. So I think in the course of this sort of period that the period that Göbekli Tepe was settled, from the mid-10th millennium to sort of the end of the 9th, we have an increase also not only in the sedentism but also in the storage capabilities.
For me, now having seen the enormity of the site, I must qualify that, the enormity of the bit of Göbekli Tepe that you've excavated so far, so the implication is extraordinary about the size of the settlement, and put it that way, is that these people absolutely had the environment handled and how they could extract the most from the environment. This landscape stretching out, before us, and we just underestimate how they were utilising that landscape, both in terms of gathering whatever grains it was, or hunting gazelle, it seems, on an almost industrial scale.
And not only that, I mean, you think about what also do you need when you're living in a settlement. You need water. And they were actually harvesting the rainwater. And we have good evidence of that. We have small, in the rocks here along the edge of the plateau, we have cisterns, for example. And a few years back as well, actually we have on site, within the northwestern part of the site that you can see behind us here, we have also channels carved into the bedrock, which were covered by limestone slabs, where they were channeling the water. And then on the other side of this sort of depression here in the northwestern part of the site, we have a very large pit, 8 meters wide in diameter, 3 meters deep, where we actually think they were actually storing the rainwater. So a very big cistern on site in the settlement. Nice. And that's perhaps not the only one that we have here. As you say, only a fraction of the site's been excavated. Yes. So they knew what they were doing. They had the technology to provide enough foodstuffs, victuals for the people here in living at the site, for providing water. It was a very advanced community.
Maybe it helps illustrate by telling us, what that is behind you, because we can't fail to notice something looking suspiciously like a spaceship. Yeah. Let's walk over there.
Yeah, let's walk over there. And before we became a UNESCO site, we had these shelters constructed, protective shelters for the archaeology. One of them is over the main excavation area, and it's sort of, visitors walk around there. There's a visitor pathway, and this one is still not accessible to the public. This is one that's actually just for us archaeologists to give us some shade for our work and protect obviously the monuments underneath. And in this area, you can see where the legs of this structure go down into the ground. They're actually anchored into the limestone plateau. And of course, before we could do that work, or before that work was done, of course, we had to remove all the archaeology. So this gave us a really good insight into the entire stratigraphy of the site in these areas, down to the limestone plateau. And it was in one of these, in fact, in the one just in front of us, that we have this very early evidence for domestic architecture. We have an activity zone with a hearth or several hearths. We have evidence for bone tools. It's a very dense. Usually we do find bone tools occasionally at the site, but here there were higher frequencies of bone tools. We also have evidence for bead production, so they're making beads, sitting around the hearth, around the campfire, between the domestic structures, making beads from bird bone and stone. So really, and of course the finds coming out of here, we've got obviously lots of lithics from the knapping that was going on. We've got grinding stones. So it really smells like a domestic site. Yeah. And compared to other sites of the same time, PPNA, so last half of the 10th millennium, the structures that we found here are very comparable. So we're very certain that we have, from the earliest levels of the site, constructed directly, or more or less directly, onto the natural limestone plateau, the earliest occupation levels.
So it's the thing is, it's the making of the beads for me that you don't sit around making yourself fancy jewellery if you haven't really got life pretty sorted out.
Well, I think that's a bit of a misnomer about the Stone Age, that people always think they were struggling to survive. They were off there trying to hunt the animals and to just to survive every day. But of course, here we can see that isn't the case, even before that, obviously. But I mean, this is, the people knew what they were doing. They had technologies that probably we don't even, know of today, or haven't discovered yet. In fact, I mean, I mentioned the water systems, for example. Yes. That's something new on site. The channels and everything. So they had it sussed. Yeah, you're quite right.
Fantastic.
The point about that thing, about having their food handled, is the most crucial aspect of establishing that there was a life before Göbekli Tepe.
This notion of Göbekli Tepe being a ground zero and this standalone, this island in a primitive world is just so wrong, because we know now that there are hundreds of these other sites.
There was culture before Göbekli Tepe. There were lifeways before Göbekli Tepe, and people thriving for thousands of years in that landscape before Göbekli Tepe.
Nothing's quick. Things happen over 1,000 years, 2,000 years. It's a gradual progression. Wherever you go, it's a gradual progression. And Göbekli Tepe was not by any means the first.
This programme is part, and probably one of the first in the series we're calling Göbekli Tepe to Stonehenge, which may give the impression that we have Göbekli Tepe as the start of all things moving forward till you get to Stonehenge and beyond. But actually it's not the case. I think one thing we want to try and get over, that Göbekli Tepe may, and the other large sites like it, may actually represent the end of a way of being, and certain life ways that had been adopted and had been tremendously successful over the past 10,000 years. And in actual fact, maybe it was too successful. Maybe it was these settlements were too impactful on the environment, and maybe they had to find new ways of being that weren't so concentrated in the landscape. So we put it out there. In actual fact, Göbekli Tepe represents the end of a certain culture, of a certain way of being, rather than the beginning, indeed.